are continuing our study in Ephesians, the 6th chapter. We are picking up at verse 10, and we're going to start seeing a wrap-up, kind of what Paul has been trying to express to the brethren in Ephesus. And so he's going to begin setting them up for a final thing that they need to really be doing. And so he starts out. We'll start out in verse 10. He says, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might." And so as we look at this term or this idea of finally, one writer put it as in light of everything that we've just talked about. You know, we've gone through this, and you can kind of list for them as you're teaching. And again, I want this to kind of be a teaching tool as well. You can kind of do a summary of what you've looked at up to this point and say, finally, or in light of these things. One writer put it this way, and I thought there were some interesting thoughts. It's a little deeper than you might go, but for your benefit. In light of the glorious standing you have as a child, in light of his great plan of the ages that God has made you a part of, in light of the plan for Christian maturity and growth that he's given to you, in light of the conduct God calls every believer to live, in light of the filling of the Spirit and our walk in the Spirit, in light of all this, there is a battle to fight in the Christian life. So after all these things, and in light of all of these things that have taken place, the last thing that you need to recognize now is how to walk worthy as a soldier. He's taught you how to walk worthy in various aspects, but he's reminding them, as we are taught when we're young, you're now in the army of the Lord, right? We sing about that. We talk about it. As we grow up, there's all kinds of lessons and things that we can use as children to look at and see what those things mean. What he's really trying to remind them of as he moves into this, he says, you need to be strong in the Lord. He doesn't say, finally, brethren, you need to really start to rely on your strength, start doing these things, and say, start building up your own strength. Doesn't you think? One would think he might say that, right? But he's talked about doing those things already. But he's saying, you need to be strong in the Lord. Like how one person put it, he said, self-empowerment doesn't work against the devil. And that's true. And don't we see people in the world today, and obviously it was an issue at that time as well, where some are trying to do it on their own. They're trying to stand up against the enemy. They're trying to be strong as a soldier in themselves, right? In their own power. Well, I believe Paul is going to make it very clear to these Christians and to us today that won't work. Not that it's a bad idea. You really shouldn't do this. It's not it won't work. The only way that you're going to be able to walk worthy of a soldier is if you do so by being strong in the Lord. And what happens to an unworthy soldier? What happens to a soldier who is not performing the duties he's expected to perform the way he's expected to perform them? There's consequences, right? It's the same thing in the Lord's army. There are things that we are expected to do, and there will be consequences for lack of performing those duties. But also, what happens when a soldier does perform the way they're supposed to? Don't you see where there are merits and there are rewards that are given for good service? Well, guess what? There's reward that you'll be given for good service in the Lord's army as well. And so, using this analogy helps people to understand what it is that we're talking about. And we all understand that when you start using a military concept, that you're always thinking about that we equate the military and war together. It just seems to be a standard thing. Why does the military exist? In case a war were to take place, right? I mean, it really does. There's a reason, and it's to be involved. But here the situation is, as we talk about it, the war is taking place. And Paul's going to make that very clear as well. And we're not there yet, but that's going to be there. So he goes on to say, and in the power of his might. And so, again, some people may say that, Rob, you're getting a little bit too picky, or maybe you're looking a little too deep. I don't think this is a little too deep, and I don't think it's too picky. when we see the power of his might, and we understand that many times the world thinks of power and might being synonymous, that maybe we need to look a little bit deeper. As a matter of fact, as I looked up the definitions of each of these two words, each of them use the synonym of the other term. But they're two different things. And so we need to understand what those two different things are, right? Strong in the power of his might. And there's a reason why. Might is described as an intrinsic energy that someone possesses to be able to achieve things. It's kind of what I would like to call, it's the well that you can draw from, right? It's the well that you can draw from in order to do something. Power is drawing from that well and using that might that exists in order to perform. And so if we look at it in that standpoint and we sing the power of his might, we understand it's not the wellspring of ourselves that we can draw from, but we're drawing from the reserve of strength and power that God has. And doesn't that change things quite a bit in our mind when we really look a little bit deeper? We're talking about drawing on the reserve energy that God the Father has. And who has more power than God? Right? So this reserve is unlimited. One writer said, God has a vast reservoir of might that can be realized as power in our Christian life, but his might does not work in me if I sit passively by. It does not work on me as I rely on it and step out to do the work. I can rely on it and do no work. I can do work without relying on it. But both of these fall short. I must rely on his might and then go and interpret or intrinsically turn that into my power, right? The power that he gives me. The two have to work together or it can't be done. We must accept what God is trying to say. And what he is trying to say is, if we rely on our own power, if we try to draw only from the reserve of strength that we have, it will not work. Okay? Oh, Rob, you're speaking in you're speaking in absolutes. Yes, I am. Because it's an absolute. There is no question. If you do not rely on the might of the Lord and the power you try to use, it's not strong enough. And the reserve that you have, it's not strong enough. That's why God allows you to pull from his might. So again, he's reminding these people, as he's saying, he's going to be saying you are in a war, but the thought of war in general and the idea of being a soldier is, understand, soldier, your strength is coming from somewhere else. And when you go to battle, you better be prepared to know how to get that strength. And you better know how to get that power. So as we look a little bit further, he then makes the statement in verse 11, put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. And so the first thing he says is, now you have to do something. Put on the armor. It's there for you. But how good is it if it just sits there? What soldier ever got ready to go to battle, left his armor behind, said, well, I have armor. I have armor, right? I didn't put it on, but I've got it. You know, we kind of do that today if we don't put the armor on. It's there. It's available to us. We're in a war. He's telling Christians you're in a war, and you're making a choice to go out to battle completely exposed to being harmed. How long are you going to last as a soldier in battle with no armor? What is your superior? If you were in an army, don't you think that your superiors would tell you, get your stuff on? Put on what you need to put on. Paul says that relying on the power of God means putting the armor on. This is how we become strong in the Lord. We have God's armor that we depend on when we're attacked. So it says, put on, but he says not just the armor of God, but there's a word there. He says, put on the whole armor of God. Well, you know what? Some might say, but this wouldn't work in the military today, but just as an example, I got this really great new haircut. And if I put a helmet on my head, it's going to ruin that really good look that I have, right? So I'm going to leave the helmet behind, but I'm going to put on everything else. And he goes out into battle, and where is he attacked? He's attacked in his head, right? Okay, so nobody's going to accept the argument that you can't. Okay, well, I'm going to make sure that my head is protected, but you know what? That breastplate's awful heavy. So, my head's protected, I'll be just fine, so I'll leave the breastplate behind, and I'll go out into war. And now where's he going to be attacked? Where the breastplate would have been, right? You see, the armor doesn't work if you don't use it all. Okay? Side point, Scripture doesn't work if you don't use it all, right? You can't take just bits and pieces. But as we're looking at what he's talking about, he makes a point of saying whole. He could have said put on the armor. I think there's a reason that the word whole is in there, though, emphasizing the importance of each and every piece, again, so that absolutely nothing is exposed. Because your enemy is going to know exactly where to look. Okay. Guarantee. Your enemy is going to know where your weak spot is. Wherever you leave an opening, that's where he's going to go. How do I know that? Well, because we're taught who our enemy is, and we'll look at that in a minute. But we've seen it in Scripture where he's done it, right? Didn't he try to attack Christ's, what would be considered weak spots at that point? He's hungry, so he tempts him in certain ways. So he knows, and so we need that whole armor so that we can stand against the wiles of the devil. And as I thought about this next picture, it never dawned on me, if you can't tell, that's a card for Wile E. Coyote from the Coyote and Roadrunner cartoon. And it never dawned on me why that name is so perfect. Because the first name is Wile. And the wiles are schemes, right? They're plannings, they're cunning ways for the person to be trapped. So Wile E. Coyote was one who was trying to trap who? Trap the Roadrunner, right? And over and over and over again, you see the various tools that he tries to use to make that happen. That's where that idea, boy, didn't know we could learn from cartoons, but there it is. There is this idea of he's trying to deceive. The definition of wiles is actually clever tricks used by someone to get what they want, right? They're clever ways. It doesn't say they're just attempts, but it's clever. It's something that might likely work, right? It is something that might likely catch you off guard. It is a trick or a stratagem intended to ensnare or deceive. So as he talks about standing against the wiles of the devil, who's your enemy, he's letting you know your enemy is out to deceive you and ensnare you. That's his goal. That's why you need the armor, because whether you put on the armor or not, whether you choose to engage in the battle that exists, he's coming for you. Because you are in a battle whether you choose to fight that battle or not. Again, you're in the battle. The question is going to be, are you prepared for the battle? Are you going to do what it takes to live and survive the battle? Or are you going to sit back and allow yourself to die? Right? Just like in a physical war, if you go to war without preparation, you're most likely going to wind up dying. That's the spiritual. If you go to war without spiritually being prepared with what you need with the armor, then you're very most likely going to die spiritually. Just some other terms that are synonymous with the idea of wile would be guile, ruses, ploys, schemings, subterfuge, deception, right? Deception is a big one, isn't it? Deception for Satan is a big one. But as you're teaching someone and as you're talking about these things, emphasize those points of understanding what can happen without armor in a physical battle and what will happen then spiritually as well. put those things together for them, for yourself as well. But put it together so that people that may not understand spiritual concepts can start to begin to understand spiritual concepts. Why did Paul do it this way? So that we could start to understand the spiritual concepts, right? Why did Christ preach in parables? Because he was taking something that made sense to them already and using it in a way to apply it to something spiritual that they might have struggled with otherwise. And so there's something to be said for that particular approach. But as they say, in any war, the first thing you want to do in any battle is know your enemy. That if you know your enemy, if you can foresee what they may be doing, very quickly, I tell you, I'm a sports nut. Does the term Deflategate mean anything to anybody? What was the big thing that they were so wrong? They got the enemy's playbook, right? The argument was they got the enemy's playbook. Well, why did they do that? So that they knew what to do in order to defend what was coming, right? So that the schemes, and don't they call, what kind of offensive scheme are you running? And the goal is to deceive the defense into going the wrong way, right? We understand that. If you know what the opponent's going to be doing, you're a whole lot better off, aren't you? And there wouldn't be so much effort. Well, guess what? We have a lot of the playbook of Satan in Scripture. There's a lot there if we take the time to look at it. And you know what? It wouldn't have done that team a bit of good to take it but never open it, would it? And it wouldn't do any good to have the Scriptures and maybe have some ideas about the schemings of the devil and seeing some of those, but never opening up and reading it, right? Don't we have examples? I mean, clear back to in the garden, right? We start with how he deceives right from the beginning. He's called a liar and the father of lies. How did he start out? Through deception and lies in the very beginning. So these are things that we can bring out. And then he says, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. And so maybe this idea is forgotten by a lot of Christians, or maybe it's just not that understood, that we realize that we're not in a flesh and blood battle, so we sometimes don't understand the fact that we're in a war. We don't really realize it because there are some spiritual things that maybe we can't see physically with our eyes. We can't see some of what's taking place, and so we kind of lose track of what's happening. Paul writes about this in 2 Corinthians, just as a subnote. Though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. Our weapons are not carnal. Our weapons are not physical. You don't want to go into a spiritual battle with only a physical weapon. Right? You don't want to go in. You need some spiritual weapons, don't you? You need some spiritual weapons. And so it's just a reminder that maybe you can't see it, but this is not against flesh and blood. And then he gives a list against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. And everyone looks at this, well, wait a minute now. What are all these things, right? This is getting a little too deep for somebody that's learning for the first time. Doesn't have to. What's just taken place? He gives us a variety of terms that refer to those who are our spiritual enemies. Whether we understand the rating system or exactly how that works or what that looks like, what we do know is this is a list of the various spiritual enemies that we have, and they are on different levels, but they all have the same goal. And that same goal is to knock you from where you are. Knock the Christian down from his place of standing. So yes, there is some confusion. There is a lot of study that needs to go into understanding what this is talking about. In an initial type of class that we're talking about doing, it's not the time or the place. It's the time or and the place to say, he's given you a list. These are things you need to be aware of. And for simplicity's sake, and we can come back again, but to keep it easy to understand, you have a whole list of enemies in a whole different level, a bunch of categories, and they all want to do the same thing. So you better be ready. That's what he's telling them. without going any deeper than that. We're going to sum up with verse 13. We're just about to the end of our lesson here this evening. So he says, once again, you have to take up the whole armor of God. As you're preparing for battle, once again, this is what you're supposed to do. He is trying to convince them that they need this armor, that they must understand how important it is. He's come back to it a couple of different times now. You have to take up this armor. Excuse me. Why? Because if you don't, you will lose. He keeps coming back to the same thing, because if you don't do this, you're going to lose. Why do you take it up? He tells you, so that you may be able to withstand in the evil day. You're going to need this, right? Now, again, people want to get hung up on the idea of the evil day, and is he talking about a specific day? Well, let's just talk about the context of what we've looked at. If you do a summary of what you've looked at, remember how Paul had mentioned in the past that the days are evil? I don't believe he's talking about a specific day. I believe he's talking about one of those evil days. It's going to come, right? Do we have to specifically say it? Or do we understand that the days are evil? There's going to come a time that you need to withstand. And that won't be a good day, right? It won't be a good day, and you need to be prepared. I don't get to say I'm going to pick day 362 out of 365 days a year, and that's the day that I'm ready. The days are evil. There is an evil day coming. I don't know what that day will be, but I'm going to be ready. Maybe that's how you can express that just a little bit. So you do these things because he wants you to be able to withstand. He's telling you, if you don't do these things, you die. But if you do these things, you're going to be able to withstand. And he goes on to say, and having done all, to stand. What does that mean? It means we can't sit back passively, right? It means we don't sit back and let the battle come to us, right? We don't sit back and do nothing, and then, once Satan's already on top of us, we go ahead and say, now it's time to put the armor on. He says, having done all, to stand. You've prepared and you've done everything that you can to be ready for that day. It's proactive, it's not reactive. But so many people in the world, and so many people even in the church, are living with the idea of a reactive. You know, oh man, Satan's really hitting me hard these past few weeks. I better get my armor on. If he's already been hitting you the past few weeks, he's put the dents in the body already before you even get your armor on, right? Or you can say, Satan's tried real hard to get at me, but the armor's been on. And I've been okay. I've done everything that I could. I was prepared for when it came. And guess what? I was able to withstand. Why? Because I was proactive. Because I did all that needed to be done in order to stand. And for the end of our lesson, you see whatever your 100% looks like, that's what you give. You give it 100%. I wanted to go back to one final thought, and we'll close out. And that is, there's good news in verse 13. You may be able to withstand in the evil day. You may be able to, provided you have put on the armor of God and done those things. The truth is, if you do what he's telling you to do, you will withstand. He's not saying it'll be easy, but you'll be prepared and you'll withstand. But if you don't do the things that you need to do, if you don't do everything you can, have your armor on and do those things, you won't withstand. The good news is, though, he's telling you how to win. If you do these things, you will be able to withstand. That's his message. That's our message for the evening. I will leave you with the thought that what's going to happen over the course of the next part of the lesson, he's now going to help you with all of the things that you need to have. He's talked about this is what you need. Now he's going to talk about every piece, and he's going to let them know what's important. So, as always, you never want to close out an opportunity without a reminder, and this can be true as well with people that you're studying with, that there will come a time when this world will come to an end. And there will come a time when all men will face the eternal question. And there'll either be a good answer and a good reward, or there'll be a poor answer and an unbelievably poor reward. And if you're in a situation where you don't have the good answer, if you don't have the correct answer, you need to fix it. And you need to be proactive and not reactive like we've talked about. You need to be proactive today and start doing everything you can for when Satan comes. Because he's coming. And you've either put the armor on, and you're either in the armor of God and you've put Christ on, or you're just out there wide open, an easy target for Satan to take you down. If you want to be safe, if you want to be protected, and if you want the victory, you want and need Jesus Christ. And you can have him in the way that you're taught if you just simply make it known while we stand and while we sing.